Okay, I think I got it figured out now. So just bear with me 1 second. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tim Ware. I'm the administrative assistant here at the George Tyler Moore Center for the Study of the Civil War at Shepherd. And today, we had some technical difficulties getting started. But today we welcome Mr. Eric Buckland, a author and historian specifically on Mosby's Rangers, to provide a program today. Mr. Buckland is a graduate of the University of Kansas, where he gained his BA in English and a commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Army. His military career will span 22 years, with most of that time spent in special forces, commonly referred to as the Green Berets. He will retire as a lieutenant colonel, and some awards he received while in the service include the Special Forces and Ranger tabs, the Master Parachutist badge, Special Forces Combat Diver, Scuba badge, and the Combat Infantryman's badge. So before we continue, thank you for your service, Mr. Buckland. And as far as his historian part of his career, he has written several books about the men who rode with Mosby, including From Rockbridge to Loudon, Mosby's Cadet Rangers, They Rode with Mosby, Mosby's Rangers, A Legacy of Success, and Mosby's Rangers, Colts and Courage. And he currently serves as the president of the Stuart Mosby Historical Society. So again, welcome, Eric, and we thank you for taking your time today to provide this program for us. But before we get into the details of the program, I do have one question for Eric. What sparked your interest in Mosby's Rangers?
I think primarily the Rangers are part of the legacy or heritage of both U.S. Army Special Forces and U.S. Army Rangers. I never had the honor of serving in the 75th Ranger Regiment, but I did go through Ranger school, so I'm what you would call Ranger qualified. But so the connection was there, and then I lived very, very close to what's considered Mosby's Confederacy, and I started to research the men who rode with Mosby when my youngest son was a rat for a freshman at Virginia Military Institute, and I found that 57 men had both attended VMI and had been with Mosby. And as I started to research the men, I just found their lives to be very, very compelling, both during and after the war. And so I've been doing that now for about 12 years.
Okay. So if you followed along with us in some of our previous programs, primarily with Dr. Broomall in the lead, those were kind of formatted as like panel discussions. So we're going to do our program today a little bit differently. So this program is going to be directly headed by Mr. Buckland. He's going to take the reins from me once I stop speaking. It's going to be about a 45-minute or so presentation about the formation of Mosby's Rangers in June of 1863, and the actions he takes on the periphery of the Gettysburg Campaign as the two armies begin heading north. And then if you have any questions, feel free to post them or comment them in the video here, and I will pick out as many as I can for a brief question and answer period we'll have at the end of the presentation. So with that, Mr. Buckland, if you'd like to take it away, and I will drop out.
All right, well, thank you very much, Tim, for the introduction, and thanks to all of you who've joined. As Tim said, the intent today is to talk about Mosby's Rangers and very quickly who they were and then what they were doing in June of 1863. As a little bit of a background, the group that would become known as Mosby's Rangers had been operating in Northern Virginia since January of 1863. They had started with a group of 9 men who had been loaned to Mosby. Mosby was a scout for General Jeb Stuart. Jeb Stuart had loaned him 9 men to begin some operations that Mosby had been espousing for at least a few months, as far as operating behind Union lines and trying to disrupt their lines of communication, and just being just to be essentially as annoying as possible to the Union military. As a result of some of the success that he had, Mosby, some people believe that he was a lieutenant or a captain when he started the operations in January. He was not. He, in fact, had been a lieutenant earlier in the war, resigned his commission, and when he started as a partisan ranger, he actually had no rank whatsoever. At best, he could have been considered a scout. But as a result of his successes, he was promoted to captain and then very quickly to major. And because of the notoriety and the fame that this group of men achieved very quickly, Mosby started to have recruits come to join him. And by the 1st of June, 1863, that group of 9 men, again loaned to him by Stuart, had grown to about 60 men who would begin to ride with him on a more permanent basis. From the very beginning, Mosby's intent, as I said, was to threaten and harass the Union Army. The explosions you see here give you an idea of where Mosby operated in northern Virginia: Fairfax, Loudoun, Fauquier, Warren, and Clark counties primarily. He really wanted to do nothing more than disrupt Union lines of communication and draw enemy forces, Union forces, away from the main battle area where Lee was confronting the Union Army down close to Fredericksburg when Mosby started his operations. It was never his intent to fight as a regular cavalry unit, column of 4 attacking with sabers drawn. He very much wanted to use guerrilla tactics from the beginning, and from the beginning he did so and was very successful in what he did. Up until the time of his death, after his wounding at Yellow Tavern, Mosby reported directly to Jeb Stuart. Mosby always had a great deal of gratitude to Jeb Stuart for allowing him to begin his operations as a partisan ranger, and Mosby very much looked upon Stuart as his benefactor and his mentor. Now, going along with the idea, the concept of just continuing to do operations to annoy Union forces, Mosby would almost on a daily basis, starting really in January '63, have patrols out either to find where the Union Army was, what targets were nearby, what the situation was, or to actually conduct raids that he had planned. He did that on really almost a daily basis. And so in June of 1863, that continuum of operations was ongoing. And on the 3rd of June, Mosby took about 50 men with him and with a plan to conduct an ambush near a church on Frying Pan Road up in northern Fairfax County. In order to trigger that ambush, he sent 4 rangers out, shown here: Bush Underwood, Frank Williams, Richard Sowers, and John Saunders, to hit a known Union patrol that would run from Fox's Mill on Difficult Run out to Frying Pan Church on a daily basis. Once these 4 rangers could hit that Union patrol and draw them into a chase, it was Mosby's intent that these 4 men would lead the Union cavalry into an ambush that Mosby would establish with the 50 or so men that he had with him. However, almost as soon as the first engagement, those 4 rangers started, it became known to Bush Underwood, who was leading that patrol, that there were multiple Union patrols operating in the area, not necessarily together, but close enough that they could respond to each other's activities. And so suddenly, instead of going up against one column, Mosby found that he would be confronted by 2. He changed his concept of this fight a little bit and had Underwood attack the second group. and then he would try to maneuver against them as well. But then a third and a fourth Union patrol came into the picture, again, not necessarily working together, but certainly reacting to each other's fights. And so Mosby got in, actually bit off a little bit more than he could chew and had to begin to withdraw. One of the Union units who reacted to this was commanded by a Colonel George Gray from the 6th Michigan Cavalry. And Mosby found himself somewhat outnumbered in this fight. And as I said, they had to begin to pull back. But in that fight, and the name I'd like you to remember, was one of Mosby's volunteer surgeons, Dr. Lawrence Sterling Alexander, and he was captured in that fight. Now, we will hear more a little bit about him in just a little bit. But again, this was just an example of almost the constant fights that Mosby would have due to the fact that he always had patrols out looking to start something with the Union forces and to keep them back on their heels as best he could. On the 9th of June, Mosby went to a place called Old Denton, or as a lot of us refer to it, the Hathaway House, owned by a man named James Hathaway. Mosby went there to visit his wife and 2 small children. On the evening of the 8th of June, members of the 1st New York Lincoln Cavalry had gained intelligence that Mosby was in fact staying at the Hathaway House, and they moved from Salem, Virginia toward the Hathaway House with hopes of capturing Mosby. They approached the house with hand-picked men, as one of the captains in charge of the New York Cavalry said. They came to the door, knocked on the door. The Hathaways were slow to respond, and essentially they would burst in the front door, but there was enough of a delay in time that Mosby, who was in fact inside, was able to crawl out from his bedroom on the 2nd floor where he was staying with his wife Pauline onto the limb of a tree. The Union Cavalry came into the room where Mosby had been staying, found his wife, and found Mosby's spurs, but did not find Mosby. And they looked literally high and low for Mosby throughout the house, and even stood under the tree where Mosby was hiding, but they could not find him. They did, though, go to the barn where Mosby had stabled one of his prized horses and took the horse. That horse was given to a sergeant named Russell Fortney from the 1st New York Cavalry, who promptly named the horse Lady Mosby in honor of Mrs. Mosby, who all the Union soldiers who had contact with her in the search for her husband had decided was decidedly handsome, but very unkindly in her attitude toward Northern soldiers. And although this harkens somewhat of a legendary type story, Mosby hiding in the tree and escaping capture, this in fact is a true story. And the Union troopers would find out later that they had missed Mosby only by possibly a matter of feet, having not looked up into the tree that some of them stood under, or further out into the tree as they gazed outside the window where Mosby had been with his wife. I don't think it's hyperbole to say that had Mosby in fact been captured that night, we wouldn't be having this discussion now. Mosby had done a couple of good operations prior to this to capture General Stoughton in March, being one that truly put him on the map. But it was the ensuing 2 years of operations up until April 1865 that really made Mosby and his Rangers legendary. And had he been captured that night or early morning of 9 June 1863, I don't think we'd be having this discussion. Now, getting over, I suppose, his near miss, Mosby would bring 4 of his men to the Caleb Rector House in Rector's Crossroads, the town now known as Atoka. The house still stands, and he would bring those 4 men into the front parlor of the Caleb Rector House and tell them at that point that he was forming Company A of the 43rd Battalion Virginia Cavalry. Up until that time, Mosby had been leading just a group of men. It was an informal collection of men. Mosby himself called it Mosby's conglomerates. But on the 10th of June, that group of men would become a formal unit within the Confederate Army, again, the 43rd Battalion, Virginia Cavalry. He brought those 4 men into the room, told them he was forming the unit and that they were to be commissioned as officers of A Company. James Foster, William Turner, William Hunter, and George Whites-Carver. Foster was made captain. Turner, first lieutenant, Hunter, second lieutenant, Whites-Carver, third lieutenant, and they signed their commissioning papers in the Caleb Rector House. They then mounted and rode about a mile from the Caleb Rector House to meet at a stone schoolhouse, field schoolhouse, where the remainder of the men had collected, with the expectation that something was about to happen, but not knowing what it might be. And it was there that Mosby started one of his normal procedures when he formed a new company. Because he had been told by Jeb Stuart prior to the forming of the 43rd, prior to the forming of A Company, that he had to hold elections for the officers. Mosby did not like elections due to some past experiences he had, so he did it his own way. And when he rode up to the field, to the schoolhouse with his 4 men, he gathered the other men around him, told them that they were going to form Company A of the 43rd Battalion, Virginia Cavalry, and that nominations for officers would now be open. As soon as he said that, he read his slate, his own slate, Foster, Turner, Hunter, and Whites-Carver, and then closed nominations and asked for a vote. This was the first and only time when he followed that procedure that there was any pushback from the men, because some of the men thought other Rangers were better qualified to be officers. In fact, many thought that William Lyle Hunter maybe should have been the company commander, because in fact, James Willie Foster was only 19 years of age, but he had shown Mosby something, and Mosby had selected him to be the first captain in his command. As I stated, there was some pushback from the men, and Mosby said, "This is my slate. These are my nominees. If you don't like it, you can leave the command, but these will be your officers." And from then forward, as he formed A all the way through H companies, the officers in command, subordinate command, and Mosby's Rangers were handpicked by Mosby. And one of the things I truly respect about Mosby is the fact that he never played favorites. He had some men who were very, very close friends to him that would not make rank, others that would make some rank, but not as much as you might expect, because they were such great friends. But officers in the 43rd Battalion Virginia Cavalry were picked by Mosby based on merit and merit alone. He looked for men who were intelligent, brave, who understood what he, Mosby, wanted to do, and they were picked accordingly as officers in his command. Now, normal procedure for Mosby, along with that handpicking his officers, was to launch a newly formed company on their first operation so they could, let's say, make their bones. And so later on the 10th into the 11th of June, A Company of the 43rd will conduct a raid on Seneca Mills. In that fight, Captain Charles W. Dean from the 6th Michigan Cavalry, who was in charge of a picket post up around Seneca Mills, put up a good fight. And he made 3 or 4 stands as the Rangers pushed against them. And as a result, Captain William Bronner, again, this was not uncommon. Bronner was from the 15th Virginia, but he, along with 20 or so of his men, went on the raid with Mosby's men. It was not uncommon for men from other units to throw in with Mosby for a raid or two, sometimes just for the adventure, sometimes for the action, sometimes because they needed new horses or equipment. But in this raid, Captain Bronner and some of his men from the Prince William Rangers would go on the raid, and Bronner would in fact be killed in action. Also killed in action in that fight, and again, due to Dean's good stand and the ability to keep his men together and continue to fight back against the Rangers, 3rd Lieutenant George Whites-Carver was killed in action. So he spent 1 day at most as a lieutenant in A Company of the 43rd. As a result of that raid on Seneca Mills, the Union Cavalry was energized, and they began to push down from the Potomac into Northern Virginia in 3 different columns, looking for Mosby and his men. One of these groups of Union Cavalry went into Leesburg, commanded by Major John Hammond of the 5th New York Cavalry, who would later be, as I noted here, would become a congressman. Hammond led some of the men from the 5th New York into Leesburg, where they captured 5 or 6 Rangers, and one of those Rangers who was captured was Captain James Willie Foster, the newly appointed captain of Company A, 43rd Battalion Virginia Cavalry. So within about 48 hours, 2 of the 4 handpicked officers from Mosby's 1st Company were out of the war. Foster would remain a POW for the remainder of the war. He would not be exchanged and paroled, and he would never get back with Mosby's Rangers. It was definitely a dangerous business to be a leader in Mosby's command. And of those 4 men I mentioned, Foster, Hunter, Turner, and Whites-Carver, within a year, out of those 4 men, 2 would be dead and 2 would be POWs. Mosby's Confederacy was bordered on the north and the east by the Potomac River, on the west by the Blue Ridge Mountains, and the south by the Rappahannock River. And that's essentially where Mosby would operate. A great number of operations were conducted into Fairfax County, but the men lived essentially in Loudon and Fauquier. And up until the middle of June, the Rangers were really the only military organization in that area. In fact, that area, which would become known as Mosby's Confederacy, would also be known as the debatable land, because no other units ever stayed there. They certainly would pass through there, but only on their way to somewhere else. But come the middle of June, things changed a little bit for Mosby, and that somewhat feeling of safety they had, except when Union patrols came in, would be diminished when the Union Army started to push in force into Mosby's Confederacy, especially the Union Cavalry, which was looking for Lee's army, which at that point was traveling down the Shenandoah Valley on its way to what would end up being the Battle of Gettysburg. So the middle of June, the complexion of Mosby's Confederacy changed a little bit with this great influx of Union forces into his area of operations. And on the middle of, or on the 17th of June in the morning, Mosby would meet with Jeb Stuart U Hill, which was south of Piedmont Station, today's Delaplane, just to talk with him and share information. Mosby would tell Stuart everything he knew about what was going on. Stuart had come into the area again to conduct cavalry operations against the Union Cavalry, which was pushing west, trying to get to the gaps in the Blue Ridge Mountains to find Lee's army in the Shenandoah Valley. Stuart's mission coming east of the Blue Ridge Mountains to stop that Union Cavalry movement. And Mosby and Stuart would meet on the morning of June 17th to discuss the situation. They would meet again that afternoon, and Mosby would tell Stuart that his plan at that point was to go on up into Maryland and continue to cause confusion, hit Union lines of communication as he had been doing, and just to disrupt their flow and try to sow confusion amongst the Union forces. Stuart agreed with him as far as what he wanted to do, and they would separate. At that time, however, the fight, the cavalry fight, which would become known as the Cavalry Fight of Aldie, Middleburg, and Upperville, had begun. And Mosby in the late afternoon had given word for his men to collect at the Loudon Agricultural Mechanical Institute, a home of a man named James Gulick. He had at least, there was at least one Gulick who rode with Mosby. The Rangers had gathered there to plan on, to decide how they were going to go about the operation into Maryland. But when they gathered there, they heard the fighting that had started with the cavalry fight in Aldie. And you can see on the map here, the star showing the Gulick house. Less than about a half mile away was a massive fight between several regiments of Union Cavalry and a couple of regiments of Virginia Cavalry. And it was there that the 1st Massachusetts Cavalry would be absolutely hammered in what was essentially a large-scale ambush sprung by Confederate soldiers, Confederate cavalrymen. And the Rangers could hear that. And unusually for Mosby, hearing how large this fight was, and never one to back down from odds that were 3, 4, 5, or 6 to 1 against him, Mosby changed his plans of going into Maryland, and I'm always a little bit tickled by this, told his men to simply get out of the way, find somewhere to hunker down and get out of the way until the Union Cavalry and the following infantry got through the area. Mosby, even Mosby himself, knew that the Union force was just too large for him to get into any kind of fight with. And so he told his men to get out of the way, to hunker down. But Mosby, being Mosby, of course, went out on a scout. And he took 3 of his men with him, trusted men, Charlie Hall, Joe Nelson, and Norman Smith, and he would move down along the Little River Turnpike, today's Route 50, trying to find out what he could about the Union Army, what it was made up of, what their movements were, and maybe to see if he could discern a little bit of their intent. Again, with the hopes of bringing that intelligence back to Stuart, who could pass that on to Robert E. Lee. And as Mosby and the 3 Rangers with him continued to move along the Little River Turnpike, they came to a house owned by a man named Almond Birch. Today, the house is gone, but it stood very close to a replica mill, which is now right along Route 50 to the east of Aldie, a couple of miles. The Almond Birch house stood very close to there. Mosby and his men, as they rode by the Birch house, noticed military horses. They were equipped with the appropriate accoutrement hanging off of the horses, and Mosby realized that he had a possible target of opportunity here. And they went in and captured the Union soldiers and officers who were in the Almond Birch house. As luck would have it, 2 of those men were in fact Union officers, one an acting signal officer for the entire Army of the Potomac, who was looking for sites to set up signal stations, and another officer, William Sterling, who was in fact carrying important dispatches for General Pleasanton, who was commanding Union Cavalry. It told where all the Union forces were and what they were going to do. And Mosby, realizing he had some very, very critical information, got those dispatches and the prisoners back to General Stuart just as quickly as he possibly could. They continued to stay somewhat out of the way for the next couple of days, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th. And by about the 21st or so, the Union Army had really moved through the area, and Mosby had a little more room to breathe. He went back and forth across the Blue Ridge Mountains a couple of times, the 21st or so, and he went by a place called Ewell's Chapel. And in a discussion with a civilian near the area, someone overheard Mosby's plans when he would return through the gap near Ewell's Chapel, and that information was passed to the Union Army. And with that information, a plan was developed where troopers from the 17th Pennsylvania Cavalry and soldiers from the 14th U.S. Infantry would be combined in a small task force to set up an ambush near Ewell's Chapel. The group would be commanded by Captain Harvey Brown, shown under the arrow here. And this was all under the direction of General George Meade, who would take on a much greater position of responsibility in just a few days when he became commander of the Army of the Potomac. But a very, very well-designed plan was put together, and when the time came for Mosby, when they believed Mosby would be coming back through the gap near Ewell's Chapel, the troopers from the 17th Pennsylvania positioned themselves along the route they believed Mosby would take as bait. And the idea was that they would make contact with Mosby and his men as they were moving along the route, and then quickly flee, but hopefully lead them into the ambush that would be set up by the 14th Infantry. Mosby dutifully came along the route that the Union troopers expected him to take. Contact was made, and the Union cavalry fled as they were supposed to, and were in fact drawing Mosby and his men into the ambush that awaited near Ewell's Chapel, established by the 14th U.S. Infantry. However, as Mosby and his men began to ride up to the chapel, some of the infantrymen from the 14th U.S. stood up in all their excitement too early and fired into the troopers from the Pennsylvania Cavalry. They didn't hit any of them, but it ruined the ambush. And Mosby very quickly realized that they were in a very, very difficult situation. The Rangers engaged, but broke contact as quickly as they could. In that fight, one Union soldier was killed, a Sergeant Martin Miller, who apparently was in a tree waiting to give the rest of his men notice that Mosby and his men were coming. He was seen, he was shot and killed. And as far as anyone knows, he was buried where he fell, and he's still buried on the spot to this day. 3 Rangers were wounded in the fight. Charlie Hall wounded in the shoulder. Richard Paul Montjoy had a finger shot away, and John Newton Ballard was wounded in the leg. Meade, hearing about what had happened with the ambush, said after he received word that it was the prettiest chance they had had to dispose of Mr. Mosby, but of course they were not able to do that. A little nugget that goes along with John Newton Ballard is the fact that he in fact was wounded in the leg. It wasn't an overly serious wound, but they had to move him from where he was wounded up and over the Bull Run Mountains, and because of the movement, the bone in his leg would shatter, and it was decided that his leg would have to be amputated. He would be fitted with a prosthetic leg, would wear that, would rejoin Mosby, and in some fights would actually take that prosthetic leg off and tie it to his saddle. So he just felt more comfortable fighting that way. But in one of those fights, that prosthetic leg was destroyed, and for a while he was not able to get another one. But he in fact would end up with the prosthetic leg of Colonel Ulrich Dahlgren, a Union cavalry officer who was killed or who was wounded returning from the Gettysburg as Union cavalry was chasing Mosby or Lee on his retreat. Dahlgren was wounded in the leg, the wound would become infected. He would have his leg amputated, would be fitted with a prosthetic. He would then be killed. Dahlgren would then be killed on the raid into Richmond with Kilpatrick, and his leg would, and everything else that he had with him would be taken from the body, and John Newton Ballard would in fact end up with Ulrich Dahlgren's artificial leg that would end the war wearing that leg. On the 24th of June, Mosby would again meet with Jeb Stuart, this time at Rector's Crossroads, Atoka, and the Caleb Rector House. And it was here that Mosby gave what he thought was good intelligence on the route he suggested for Stuart to take in his move north. Unfortunately, the information that Mosby provided to Stuart, a lot of it was based off his recent raid, Mosby's recent raid to Seneca Mills. Unfortunately, that intelligence was no longer timely, and the Union Army had gotten into the area, and as a result, Stuart had to backtrack and could not go the route that Mosby had suggested. And I've always felt, and this is my opinion, I haven't really seen it anywhere else, but I've always felt that Mosby had some sense of guilt because of that information or intelligence that he had given to Stuart about the recommended route for Stuart's move north. And in his book, Stuart's Cavalry in the Gettysburg Campaign, I think John Mosby is almost shrill in his defense of Stuart, listing all the reasons why Stuart had not been wrong, why he had not been late, why he had not made mistakes along with the Gettysburg Campaign, or why there were extenuating circumstances. And I've always felt that part of that defense was because Mosby always felt some guilt in giving that bad information to Stuart. And I often wondered if Mosby thought at some point or another he would be blamed to a certain extent for the route that Stuart had taken and some of the problems, the ensuing problems that Stuart had on his ride to get up and meet up with Lee in eventually what would turn out to be the fight at Gettysburg. On the 26th of June, continuing operations, Mosby and a small group of men got back out onto the Little River Turnpike. There was not a lot of freedom of movement at this time because now follow-on Union forces were continuing to move through the area, but they did have the opportunity to jump a Union doctor and his escort and capture them. Now that Union doctor knew, if you remember now, Dr. Lawrence Sterling Alexander, the captured Ranger surgeon, the Union doctor knew that Alexander was with Mosby or had been with Mosby. Alexander was back in the Union, in a Union camp back around Vienna in Fairfax County. The doctor apparently had met him, knew where he was, and made a deal with Mosby that if Mosby would release him to go back to the Union camp rather than taking him away as a POW, he would ensure that Dr. Alexander was exchanged, released, and sent back to Mosby. And in fact, the Union doctor was good to his word. There was no problem with Union authorities, and Dr. Alexander would actually get back with Mosby's command within a couple of days. On the 28th of June, the Rangers would assemble once again with the intent of going north to link up with Lee's army, to link up with Stuart's cavalry. They crossed the Potomac River on the 1st of July. We found that the Confederate Army had passed through the area already a few days prior. Mosby did not know where they were, was not sure what direction they had taken. And so rather than really wandering around blindly up in Pennsylvania, Mosby elected to return to Virginia. Along the way, they would capture several hundred head of cattle and a few horses, all of which they would turn over to the Confederate Quartermaster Corps. If you are interested in any of the stories, some of the men I spoke about today, these are a list of the 4 books that I have available. If you do have an interest, you can contact me at info@mosbymen.com, and we can discuss any books that you might be interested in. That concludes my briefing or presentation. Are there any questions?
All right, so thank you for that. That was great. So I have one. So you talk about when Mosby's unit is being formed, like it's common practice in the Confederate Army that elections would be held for the officers. Now, why was Mosby so against having like elections? Like when he formed his unit, he gave a list of nominations and was take it or leave it, and that was that. So why was he so?
That's a great question. Earlier in the war, Mosby had been a private in the Washington Mounted Rifles. The company commander is William Grumble Jones. Grumble Jones very quickly took Mosby under his arm, under his wing, and began to mentor Mosby. The Washington Mounted Rifles would be rolled into the 1st Virginia Cavalry. Stuart would be the commander. This is very early in the war. And then when Stuart was promoted, Grumble Jones, Mosby's mentor, would be promoted and made commander of the 1st Virginia Cavalry. Again, Mosby got along very well with Jones and really respected him, liked the way he trained his men, liked the way he took care of his men. The executive officer or second of command, if you will, of the 1st Virginia at that time was Fitzhugh Lee. And Mosby and Fitz Lee hated each other. They could not stand each other. Elections were held for the 1st Virginia Cavalry. Some of the men did not like Jones because he was very tough on them. He took care of them, but he trained them hard, and he did not let them shirk their duty. Many of the men liked Lee better, and as a result, Jones would not be re-elected as commander, and Lee would be elected as commander of the 1st Virginia. By that time, Mosby was a first lieutenant and adjutant of the 1st Virginia because of Jones. When Lee was elected, Mosby knew he did not want to work for Lee. He also knew that Lee would not want Mosby, to work for him, and so Mosby resigned his commission. And I think that left a very, very bad taste in his mouth. And I think Mosby probably heard the rumblings from some of the other units where the good old boys were elected as officers because they didn't make the men do anything, which was fine until the first time they got into a fight. They realized that maybe this training and discipline stuff is worth worrying about a little bit. Mosby didn't make that mistake from the very get-go. He picked men based on merit who understood what he wanted to do.
Okay. And then what was the impetus for Mosby forming his unit? Because I know you mentioned they were considered Mosby's conglomerates. Was it like an order from the Confederate High Command, or was it like a legislative act that was put into effect about the time that Mosby begins to do his thing with his Rangers?
In April of 1862, the Confederate government passed the Partisan Ranger Act, which was sort of a nod to this idea of kind of guerrilla type units. Said that these units could be formed, cavalry, in most cases some infantry. They would be a formal part of the Confederate Army. Officers would be duly commissioned, and men would be paid the same amount as regular Confederate soldiers. The big difference being that anything you took on a raid as a partisan ranger, you could keep or sell back to the Confederate government for profit. So that law was out there. Mosby knew that law was out there, but his idea of operating the way he wanted to also went back to the fact that he hated camp life. He knew that as a private. He much preferred being out on picket or outpost duty. In fact, got in trouble one time when he was a private because he went out on a second outpost tour that he wasn't supposed to be on. He didn't want to be in camp. He hated the drudgery. So he liked to get out where the action was. And combining all those things and the fact that he was a very good scout, again, operating on his own or in a small group and having success at it, he began to espouse this idea to Stuart about staying behind enemy lines and causing trouble. So I think the Partisan Ranger Act obviously was something that stuck in the back of his mind. He also knew that would be a great way to recruit soldiers and to keep them in the unit once they had a taste of some of the booty that they would come up with. But it was really Mosby's idea to operate the way he did. And you could say that Mosby's Rangers from start to finish, from the conglomerates to the 43rd, was his idea, and it was his command start to finish.
Okay. And then feeding off of that, we had a question from our friend of the center, Mike. He wants to know what's the difference between Mosby's Rangers and Quantrell's guerrillas? Like, what can you learn about irregular warfare, comparing them, how they formed, how they were perceived by their armies, their army, respective armies in the East and the West, and the enemy, and what kind of impacts they had on the war itself?
That's a great question, and this may be hyperbole, but I've always really been intrigued by the Missouri bushwhackers. And part of that being the fact that I went to the University of Kansas and I was oblivious back in the day. Really, I was not that interested in the Civil War. I wasn't that interested in what had gone on in Bleeding, Kansas, Quantrill, etc. And of course, the University of Kansas is in Lawrence, Kansas, where Quantrill came in and sacked the place. But I've always said that where Mosby's Rangers operated to a certain extent, especially early on, almost as cavaliers, there was some chivalry involved. They tried to provide intelligence to the Confederate Army. He tried where he could to support Confederate activities, Lee's activities in the area. His idea was to draw Union forces away from where Lee was always outnumbered. So there was some supporting type action that Mosby did. I've always likened, though, and again, this is not a shot at them in any sense of the word, but I've always likened the war in Missouri to a blood feud on LSD, speed, and steroids. That really became bloodlust in many ways, and you read of the atrocities on both sides. And it's always struck me that the main intent, of course, war is always about killing, but the intent out there on both sides. You had Quantrill's men on one side. It wasn't all the bushwhackers, and then you had the Redlegs and some of the abolitionist type units on the other side, who all were pretty extreme in their ideas. It just really became about killing each other, and the worst manner you could kill somebody, the better. So I don't think Quantrill and the Missouri bushwhackers added that much strategically. I don't even think at a tactical level they added much to the war out in that theater. Mosby, I think you could argue at a tactical and operational level, did contribute to the Southern effort in Virginia, and some would argue that Mosby tied up several thousand Union soldiers to protect Washington from attack, and even in '64, Mosby attacked Sheridan's wagon train, the Berryville wagon train raid that he caused Sheridan to pull up short and slow down, and he didn't get to Richmond as quickly as he could. So I don't see a real comparison between the two forces. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it sounds like it. So with the difference between like Mosby, he seemed to be working within the rules of war, like whereas as you explained out west in Missouri, it was essentially a blood feud, as you called it. Did that have any effect on that partisan act that the Confederate Congress had passed? Because at some point I feel like they pulled back from that because they felt like the authorized units were going a little bit too far. So is there like something that they did that would cause, because if I remember reading correctly somewhere, the only two authorized units towards the end of the war were Mosby's Rangers and McNeil's Rangers in the mountains of West Virginia. So did that, I guess, the violence that other partisan groups had, did that affect any like the authorizations within the partisan act that was passed?
Another great question. I think you had a couple of things going against the concept of the Partisan Ranger Act. First, as you can well imagine, there were groups of men who saw the Partisan Ranger Act as a way to get over. They knew they could exploit the situation. Partisan Ranger units didn't live by the day-to-day drill and drudgery of the regular army. Many of the men in those type units could stay home, in fact, operated out of their homes in some cases. There was booty to be had as well. And as a result, for every valid or true partisan ranger unit that was formed, there were probably 5, 6, 7 groups that were formed that really ended up being nothing more than a bunch of thugs and brigands. And many of those groups would prey on Southern civilians as often or even more than they would attack Union forces. And so you had the Partisan Ranger Act being taken advantage of, if you will, and really being misused or abused for its intent. The second thing that would come up against the Partisan Ranger Act was that you had essentially conventional, for lack of a better word, conventionally minded officers in the Southern Army, West Point School, many of the generals, who did not understand unconventional warfare. It's no different than today's military. Again, I spent a lot of time in special forces. Back when I first got into Army Special Forces, it was all but shut down. It was only when Ronald Reagan became president that Special Forces was reinvigorated. You had an awful lot of conventional officers who did not understand unconventional operations, special operations, and wanted to be rid of the whole organization. You had the same thing in the Confederate Army. They did not like these units who weren't dressed right, as they were accustomed to. I think Lee himself, although he was audacious, he was not a risk taker, but he was audacious. He would push the envelope. He was still very much a conventional officer in the way he did things. He was very much a gentleman. That's not to say that Mosby and his Rangers weren't essentially gentlemen, but I don't think Lee ever fully understood what Mosby especially was doing. And I'm not sure he fully liked what Mosby was doing. And so because of those two things, Confederate regular officers, generals began to complain about the partisan Ranger units, and they wanted the order rescinded. So less than 18 months, maybe about a year after that, I guess about 18 months after the Partisan Ranger Act was passed, it was rescinded, and word went out that all Partisan Ranger units would be disbanded, and that all those Southern men in the Partisan Ranger units were to report and muster in to the nearest Confederate unit. But as you stated, two units were allowed to continue on as partisan Rangers, Mosby's Rangers and McNeil's Rangers. And I believe that, that was a direct reflection on the fact that they had good leadership. They understood where they could support Confederate, the regular Confederate Army's activities, and that they were very successful in the things they did. So the Partisan Ranger Act, I think in a conventionally minded army, was doomed to failure. And then men being men in many cases, it was exploited enough that the partisan Ranger units became a thorn to both the Confederate government and the Confederate citizens where they operated.
Okay, so I guess a couple more questions. So I guess working off of that, you may have answered it already. Because the conventional officers with like West Point training didn't necessarily understand the partisans' operations. Did Mosby and Robert E. Lee get along on like a personal level, or was because of Mosby's operations, did Lee kind of try and distance himself from what Mosby was doing, even though it had benefits to Lee's army in terms of tying up Union troops, stealing supplies and whatnot?
It's reported, and I have not gone through the ORs and counted, but it's been reported that Lee mentioned Mosby more than any other Confederate officer in dispatching, and it was always in a positive note. And many of the communications he had to Stewart again were very positive in what he thought of Mosby's activities. Mosby respectedly, he did not have him on a pedestal, perhaps the way some other Confederate junior Confederate officers did, or subordinates to Lee, but Mosby very much respected Lee. And in one of their meetings, and you can take this as high praise, I think, when Mosby came up to Lee, Lee said, I only have one complaint. And Mosby initially was a little bit taken aback, and Lee said, you're wounded too often. So that was sort of in a way, that's a backhanded compliment. So I think Lee continued to push for Mosby to mass his men more like a regular cavalry unit, to take out trains, to take more bridges out, and things like that. Mosby resisted because he realized that if he massed his command, even as it grew in size, he would be probably defeated and crushed. And he continued to operate in much smaller groups in a decentralized fashion. So, no, I think there was, again, I don't know that Lee fully understood what Mosby was doing. Again, I'm not sure he 100% approved the way he operated, but I think Lee fully understood that Mosby was successful and that he was of benefit to the Confederate effort.
Okay. And then somebody asked, so this is kind of like looking back from, I guess, our 2021 perspective. So the Confederate Congress passes the Partisan Ranger Act in 1862, and then legislatively speaking, almost immediately turns around and after several months of its use, rescinded it. So why did they pass it in the first place? Did they like expect that the violent acts that happened to take place? And also, did the if I'm understanding the question correctly, did the conventional army officers, I guess, what was their response to its passage? Did they have any input into it being passed, or?
I think when the Partisan Ranger Act was initially passed, men were not short in number, resources were not as few and far between as they would become. If I understand it correctly, the Partisan Ranger Act was one of many efforts the Confederate government took to keep men in or to get men to join the Confederate Army. The election of officers was one of the tools the Confederate government wanted to use to make sure they could keep men in the Army. The Partisan Ranger Act, building off of the Virginia Cavalry type attitude or concept, these men could ride to the sound of the guns and then go home at night. That was how it was envisioned, I think, to begin with. Men would fight if they could stay near their homes, if they could defend their homes. But very quickly, I think, besides the fact that Partisan Ranger Act was abused, the regular Confederate Army officers saw that this is a drain on manpower. We don't have that many men. We can't continue to have these little units running around. I need to fill the holes caused by casualties in my cavalry regiment or my infantry regiment. And so I think it was done with the best of intentions, but I don't think it panned out. And you don't hear pushback on the Partisan Ranger Act was a good 6 months, if not a year, in coming. So it's not something that immediately came to the forefront. But as the Confederates began to take more and more casualties, the conventional generals started to look at the strain, because when men's enlistments would end as well. I mean, if you have a choice, and I've talked about this before, if you have the choice between lying in a trench around Petersburg eating some rat meat, if you're lucky, dressed almost in rags, or staying in a regular home with a pretty good belly full of food on a good horse and good clothes up somewhere in northern Virginia, which way are you going to go? And so the Confederate generals started to worry about the drain on their manpower because of these men going off to the Partisan Rangers.
All right, so then our last question, going back to Mosby and his men. Somebody asked, how did Mosby's men so effectively gather and then disperse? Because I know from reading, like I think it was like August of 1864, he makes a raid around Berryville in that vicinity. He crosses the Blue Ridge, and then almost as quick as he strikes, his men disappear. It's like almost as if they melted away to the countryside. So how was he able to get his men to so effectively meet, and then once they've completed their raids, it's like they disappeared. So how did that become so effective for him?
Very early on, Mosby started a couple of what's called standard operating procedures. First was that the men would stay in private homes. There were no camps. That was to safeguard them being caught in one large group and defeated. So 2, 3, 4 Rangers would stay in their home, in a private home. But all the Rangers knew where the other Rangers were staying, because they would visit back and forth. It goes back to the idea of Mosby hating camp life. And when the men were not out on operations, they were off. And they would go back to their safe house with the rule, what they call the safe house with the rules, essentially being understood that if you heard gunfire, you would ride to the sound of the guns. If you made contact with a Union force. You would try to find out what they were doing, and then you would get to the nearest area where other Rangers were staying, alert them, and then almost like a jungle telegraph, if there were 3 Rangers in a home, 2 would ride in the direction the Union forces, the other one would ride to the next house and alert them, so on, so on, so on. So that's one way they could gather very quickly. There was also a standard operating procedure that after a raid or an operation, whoever was in command of that group of men, once they had finished, would tell them, okay, we will meet at such and such a place, Mount Zion Church, Atoka, wherever it might be, in 3 days at such and such a time. If nothing came up, again, gunfire, a Union patrol, the men would go back to their safe house, but they would disperse, knowing where they were to gather for the next time. The rule was if you didn't make that next gathering, that was fine. But if you missed another one, a second one, you were out of the unit. And so I think that's the way Mosby could quickly gather a few men, and then given some time, say for the Berryville wagon train raid, the word would be out, would be sent out. We're gathering at such and such a place, and very quickly the men would know that. So on a grand scale, the Berryville wagon train raid, somewhere between 300 and 350 Rangers gathered. Again, it was just word was put out, the command is gathering at such and such a place. Smaller scale, shots in the distance, Rangers begin to ride to the sound of the guns. Union cavalry also learned very quickly that if they bumped into a couple Rangers and shots were fired, if they stayed around, if the Yankee troopers stayed around, in a few minutes there were going to be 4 or 5 Rangers. In 10 minutes there were going to be 15. A little bit more, there'd be 30, and that the Rangers would begin to pile on them just as quickly as they could get there. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. So it's kind of like guns fired or shots fired. It's almost like you're stirring up a hornet's nest, and more gradually decide to join, and so on and so on.
Cool.
So with that, we're going to wrap this up. Again, thank you, Mr. Buckland, for taking the time out of your day to do this program for us. And this is also, shameless plug, a good lead in. Our fall seminar will be focusing on some of Mosby's actions in Loudoun County in this October. And we'll also be looking at the 1863 cavalry battles taking place in Loudoun County as the armies move northward towards Gettysburg. But again, with that, thank you all for joining us. Thank you again, Mr. Buckland. And I hope everyone has a good day.